She had been looking for her all her life, but she had no idea that a chance visit to a cafe would change everything. When the billionaire saw the familiar pendant around the waitress's neck, her heart sank. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments write, "Where are you watching this video from?" Evelyn Monroe had always lived in a world of polished surfaces and whispered expectations. From the moment she was born into the Monroe family, she was destined to uphold the legacy of one of the wealthiest industrialist dynasties in the country. Her childhood was filled with opulent mansions, private tutors, and carefully orchestrated social gatherings where she was taught how to smile just enough, how to tilt her head with the perfect measure of grace, and how to converse without ever revealing too much of herself. Her parents, Charles and Margaret Monroe, had plans for her before she could even walk, plans that revolved around wealth, power, and the meticulous curation of an unblemished reputation. She had learned early that emotions were liabilities, and that love, in the way she read about in books, was an indulgence meant for those who could afford to be reckless. The Monroes did not marry for love. They married for alliances, for the merging of fortunes, for the silent agreements that kept their influence intact. Evelyn had always known what was expected of her, until the day she met James. It had been a summer evening when she first heard him play. She had slipped away from a dreary garden party her parents were hosting at their estate, exhausted by the hollow conversations and the endless parade of suitors who saw her as nothing more than a golden ticket to power. She wandered towards the far end of the property, where the servants' quarters were nestled behind the grandiose halls of the main house. That was when she heard the sound of a piano, a melody so rich, so unrestrained, that it made her breath hitch in her throat. Drawn by the music, she followed it to a small side building where a group of servants had gathered, watching a young man play with a kind of effortless passion she had never seen before. He was a guest of one of the house workers, a musician named James Carter, who had come to visit his uncle. He played not from sheet music, but from his soul, his fingers dancing across the keys with an elegance that made the world around him fade away. Evelyn had never seen anything so beautiful. When his eyes met hers, something shifted in the air between them. He was nothing like the men she was accustomed to, those stiff, calculating businessmen who wore their ambition like armor. James was raw, unguarded, and filled with a kind of warmth that Evelyn had never known. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't realized she was missing. Their connection was immediate, electric, but dangerous. James was black, and in Evelyn's world, that fact alone was enough to make their love forbidden. But she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she wanted something that wasn't scripted, wasn't part of the Monroe plan. She found ways to see him in secret, slipping away from society gatherings to meet him in jazz clubs tucked away in the heart of the city. In the dim glow of those clubs, she discovered a world unlike any she had ever known, one where people lived for the moment, where music told stories deeper than any polite conversation at a ballroom ever could. With James, she could be herself, stripped of the expectations and pretense. He saw her not as the heir to an empire, but as a woman who longed to be free. For nearly a year, their love thrived in stolen moments and whispered promises. But the world they lived in was not kind to love that defied its boundaries. Evelyn knew that if her parents ever found out, they would do everything in their power to tear them apart. She underestimated just how far they would go. She had been careful, but not careful enough. One evening, as she returned home from meeting James, she found her father waiting for her in the study, his face carved from cold fury. He already knew. Someone had seen them together and reported back. Her mother sat beside him, her expression unreadable, but Evelyn knew what was coming before the words even left their lips. She would end it. She would never see him again. There was no room for negotiation. When she refused, the punishment was swift. She was locked away in the estate, cut off from the outside world. Letters she tried to send never reached James. She screamed, she begged, but the Montrose did not bend. Then came the final blow. She was pregnant. She realized it weeks into her imprisonment, her body betraying her in ways she couldn't hide. The moment her parents found out, the stakes changed entirely. A child, James's child, was an even greater threat to the Montrose name than their affair had been. Her father erupted in fury, but her mother's response was even more terrifying in its coldness. The child would be taken away. There would be no discussion. Evelyn fought. She swore she would never give up her baby, but she was weak, held captive by a system stronger than her will. When the time came, she was taken to a secluded location to give birth in secret. She never even got to hold her daughter. She pleaded, screamed, begged, but the nurses were deaf to her cries. She only caught a glimpse of her baby before they took her away. A tiny, beautiful girl with dark curls and soft brown skin. Evelyn was left with nothing but silence and a broken heart. Before they took her away, Evelyn managed one act of defiance. She had smuggled in a golden locket, one she had once given James as a token of their love. In a desperate moment, she slipped it into the swaddle of her daughter's blanket. It was all she could give her. One last connection to the family she was being stolen from. And then she was gone. Evelyn was forced to return to her life as if nothing had happened. Her parents arranged a marriage for her within a year, a union of wealth and power that secured their reputation once more. She played her part, smiling in photographs, making speeches, pretending she had never loved and never lost. But inside, she was hollow. The years passed, but the wound never closed. No matter how much wealth she amassed, no matter how many successes she achieved, nothing could erase the absence of her child. She tried to find her, hired detectives, searched records, but it was as if she had vanished. The orphanage was gone, the paperwork erased. Her daughter was out there somewhere, and she had no way of knowing if she was safe, if she was loved, if she even knew she had a mother who had never stopped searching for her. But fate had a way of bringing lost things back, even those stolen by time, and Evelyn Montrose had not given up hope. Evelyn Montrose had long mastered the art of living two lives. The one the world saw was the polished facade of a woman who had built an empire from the remnants of her family's wealth, a force of nature in boardrooms, a name whispered with respect among the elite. She was the epitome of power, the kind of woman who turned failing businesses into giants with a flick of her wrist, who could summon entire industries to her feet with a single phone call. To those who knew her only through headlines and magazine covers, she was the embodiment of success. But behind closed doors, when the photographers were gone and the reporters had nothing left to write, she was someone else entirely. She was a woman who had spent the last 50 years walking through life with a weight on her chest, an ache that had never dulled no matter how much time had passed. She was a mother who had lost her child to a world that had never wanted them to be together. A woman who had fought against an empire only to realize that some wars could not be won. She often wondered what her daughter had grown into, who she had become in the years that had stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Did she have a family? A life she loved? Did she ever think of the mother she never knew, Or had she buried that absence deep enough that it no longer haunted her? The questions were endless, and the answers were ghosts that taunted Evelyn in the silence of her nights. At 70 years old, she had everything most people spent their lives chasing. Money, power, influence. She had amassed it all, built a dynasty that spanned industries, from luxury hotels to investment firms, real estate conglomerates to art foundations. Her name was synonymous with prestige, her image carefully crafted to be untouchable. There was no scandal that could stain her, no whisper of weakness that could undermine her authority. She had made sure of it, but none of it mattered. She had spent her entire life achieving things that should have made her feel whole, but instead, every success only reminded her of what she had lost. Every award she accepted, every new acquisition she finalized, every triumph in the corporate world was another reminder that none of it could bring back the child she had been forced to give up. The weight of that truth pressed down on her, heavier than any burden of leadership or responsibility she had ever carried. She had tried to find her. Decades ago, when she first had the means to hire the best private investigators, she had poured every resource she had into the search. The trail had been cold from the start. The orphanage where her daughter had been taken was long gone, the records erased, as if her existence had been wiped from history. Every time she thought she was close, the path vanished into nothingness, leaving her staring at dead ends and empty files. Eventually, even the most relentless investigators admitted defeat. She had learned to live with the uncertainty, but she had never stopped looking. Even now, all these years later, she still searched in the faces of strangers, still scanned crowds for a pair of familiar eyes, still clung to the impossible hope that one day, by some stroke of fate, she would see her child again. It had become an obsession, though she never spoke of it. To the world, Evelyn Monroe was a woman who had never married again, who had no children, who had built an empire alone, and intended to leave it behind with the same solitary grace. That was the story they knew, the one she allowed them to believe. But the truth was that every decision she had ever made, every move in the corporate world, every sleepless night spent building her empire, had been driven by something deeper than ambition. It had been an attempt to fill the void that had been left behind when they took her daughter away. She had never wanted power for the sake of power. She had wanted it because she had once been powerless, and she had sworn to never let anyone take something from her again. She had wanted it because she had believed, foolishly, that if she became powerful enough, she could bend the world to her will, force it to give her back what had been stolen from her. But the world did not work that way. Now, as she sat in the penthouse office of the Monroe Corporation, looking out over the city she had conquered, she felt the weight of the years pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, but for what? There was no one to leave it to. The empire she had built would be inherited by strangers, by men in suits who saw it as nothing more than numbers on a ledger. The thought made her stomach turn. She had spent her life creating something meant to last beyond her, but without family, without a legacy that truly meant something. What was the point? For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to think about the future, not in terms of business deals and expansions, but in terms of something real. She did not have many years left. That was the cold, undeniable truth, and she could not die without knowing. The thought came suddenly, sharper than the usual dull ache that accompanied thoughts of her daughter. She could not leave this world without knowing if her child was out there, without trying one last time to find her. The idea took hold of her, growing stronger with each passing moment. She had tried before, yes. She had searched for decades, but the world had changed. Technology had advanced. Maybe there was still a way. Maybe, just maybe, fate would be kind this time. She reached for the phone on her desk and dialed the number of the one person she knew could help her. "Find her," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I don't care what it takes. Find my daughter." She hung up before she could second-guess herself. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her that she had thought was long dead. Hope. Evelyn Monroe had never believed in fate. She had built her empire on logic, strategy, and an unrelenting will to shape the world in her favor. Chance and luck were illusions, convenient excuses for those who lack the discipline to control their own destinies. But, as she stepped into the small cafe on the corner of 46th Street and Lexington Avenue, she felt something shift in the air, something almost imperceptible, like the whisper of a past that refused to stay buried. The decision to walk into this particular cafe had been impulsive. She rarely ventured into such places, intimate, unpretentious establishments where people gathered not for business deals, but for the simple pleasure of good coffee and quiet conversation. Her usual haunts were high-rise boardrooms, five-star restaurants with private dining rooms, places where power moved in invisible currents beneath polished smiles. But today, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she had chosen differently. The place was warm, almost suffocatingly so, with the scent of freshly ground coffee beans and buttered pastries thick in the air. The low hum of chatter, the occasional clatter of ceramic cups against wooden tables, the laughter of a couple seated near the window. It was the kind of atmosphere she had spent a lifetime avoiding. And yet, as she stepped inside, something about it felt right. She moved toward an empty table near the back, her sharp gaze sweeping the room with practiced efficiency. Years of navigating hostile boardrooms had trained her to read a space instantly, to assess threats and opportunities with a single glance. But what she was searching for now was something far more elusive. Then she saw her. The young woman moved with effortless grace, weaving between tables with the kind of natural poise that caught the eye without demanding attention. She wore a simple uniform, black slacks, a crisp white shirt, an apron tied neatly around her waist. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something in the quiet confidence of her posture that set her apart from the other employees. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat before she even understood why. There was something familiar about her, though she couldn't immediately place it. The high cheekbones, the strong jawline, the deep brown eyes that held a quiet intensity, features that stirred memories buried beneath decades of carefully maintained control. But it wasn't until the woman turned slightly, the dim light of the cafe catching on the delicate chain around her neck, that the world around Evelyn seemed to lurch to a halt. The necklace. A simple gold pendant, worn and slightly tarnished, but unmistakable. The intricate etching of musical notes on its surface caught the light, sending a dull gleam across the woman's collarbone. It was a sight Evelyn had not seen in over 50 years, but she knew it as well as she knew her own name. The same pendant she had placed in her newborn daughter's swaddle the day they took her away. Evelyn felt her pulse hammer in her ears, a dizzying rush of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope flooding through her veins. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the woman standing before her was the daughter she had spent a lifetime searching for. She forced herself to breathe, to steady the trembling in her hands as the young woman approached her table. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" The voice was smooth, professional, with just a hint of fatigue. Evelyn could hear the weight of long hours in it, the quiet endurance of someone who had learned to navigate the world with resilience rather than privilege. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She could only stare, the reality of what was happening settling over her like a heavy fog. The young woman, her daughter, looked at her with polite expectation, oblivious to the storm raging inside Evelyn's chest. She had spent decades preparing for this moment, rehearsing the words she would say if she ever found her child, imagining every possible scenario of reunion. But now that the moment was here, her mind was blank. She needed more time. She needed to think. "Just a coffee," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. The woman nodded, scribbled something on a small notepad, and walked away. Evelyn watched her go, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as the reality of what she had just seen threatened to unravel the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. She needed to be sure. She couldn't afford to be wrong. As she sat there, waiting for her coffee, she studied the woman's movements, searching for traces of herself, of James, of the past that had been stolen from them. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle expression, it was all there, written in the way she carried herself, in the quiet confidence of her stride, in the way she tilted her head when she listened. But it was the pendant that held her gaze, the tiny piece of metal that had defied time and distance to bring them back together. When the woman returned with the coffee, Evelyn forced herself to smile, to keep her expression neutral as she accepted the cup. "That's a beautiful necklace," she said, her voice light, conversational, as though the question meant nothing. The woman's fingers instinctively brushed against the pendant, her expression shifting ever so slightly. "Thank you," she said. "It's sentimental." Evelyn swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. "If you don't mind me asking, where did you get it?" The woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Evelyn caught it. A flicker of something in her eyes, something guarded. "It was a gift," she said finally, "from my mother, or at least, that's what I was told." Evelyn felt the ground tilt beneath her. This was real. This was happening. She had found her. For the first time in decades, she felt something crack inside her, something she had thought long dead, a fragile, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, the past could be rewritten. But how did you tell a stranger that you were the mother they never knew? How did you undo half a century of lost time? Evelyn looked at the young woman, her daughter, her mind racing, her heart aching with the weight of what she had just discovered. She had found her. Now she had to find a way to bring her home. Evelyn Moncrow had never been a woman prone to hesitation. Throughout her life, she had made decisions with the precision of a surgeon, cutting away weaknesses, carving paths where none existed. She had built her empire through sheer willpower, dismantling obstacles with calculated ease. But now, as she sat in the dimly lit cafe with the weight of discovery pressing against her chest, she found herself frozen, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. The young woman, her daughter, had walked away to serve another table, unaware that the stranger she had just taken an order from was the mother she had never known. Evelyn gripped the porcelain cup in front of her, its warmth grounding her in the present, keeping her from unraveling beneath the flood of emotions that threatened to consume her. She had spent a lifetime searching for her child. She had dreamed of this moment in countless variations, had imagined their reunion 1,000 different ways. But she had never accounted for this trembling uncertainty, this inability to move forward. How did one bridge a 50-year gap? She had no answers, only the frantic pounding of her heart and the undeniable proof of the pendant hanging around the young woman's neck. Doubt crept into her mind like a slow-moving shadow, insidious and persistent. Was it truly her daughter? The resemblance was striking, yes, but resemblance alone was not proof. And even if it was her, what right did Evelyn have to re-enter her life now, after so many years of absence? She had no way of knowing what kind of life the girl had lived, whether she had been happy, whether she had suffered. She could have a family of her own now, people she loved, people who had filled the void Evelyn had left behind. Would she even want to know the truth? Or would she see Evelyn not as a mother, but as a ghost from a past better left undisturbed? The weight of these questions pressed down on her, suffocating in their intensity. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Monroe was afraid. The woman returned with the check, placing it gently on the table with a polite but detached smile. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, her voice smooth, professional. Evelyn opened her mouth, a dozen questions forming at once, but the words caught in her throat. She had spent decades commanding boardrooms, navigating ruthless negotiations with some of the most powerful men in the world. Yet now, faced with the person she had longed for more than anything, she could barely speak. She forced herself to respond with a simple nod, watching as the young woman turned and walked away once more. Evelyn reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of an old photograph. She had carried it with her for years, a picture of her and James, taken in a moment of stolen happiness before the world had torn them apart. And beside them, swaddled in Evelyn's arms, was the tiny infant they had both loved so fiercely. Lily. That had been her name. The name Evelyn had whispered in the quiet of her empty home, the name she had repeated to herself like a prayer on sleepless nights. But she had no way of knowing if that name had survived the years, or if it had been replaced with something else. She stared at the check on the table, her thoughts racing. If she let this moment pass, would she ever get another chance? She reached for the pen beside the receipt and, with careful precision, wrote her name and number on the blank side of the paper. Then, beneath it, she hesitated before writing a single line. "I think we should talk." When she stood to leave, she placed the check face up on the table, ensuring that the woman would see it. She didn't allow herself to look back as she walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding as though she had just risked everything on a single throw of the dice. As she stepped onto the bustling New York sidewalk, the weight of what she had done settled over her. She had opened a door she could never close. Now, she could only wait and see if her daughter would step through it. The hours that followed were agonizing. Evelyn had spent a lifetime moving from one task to the next with unrelenting focus, but today there was nothing to do except wait. She sat in her penthouse apartment, staring at her phone as though willing it to ring. It didn't. The silence stretched on, each passing hour tightening the knot in her chest. Perhaps she had been too forward. Perhaps the woman had seen the note and thrown it away, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old woman with nothing better to do. By the time night fell, doubt had nearly consumed her entirely. She had made a mistake. She had spent her life preparing for this moment, but she had never considered the possibility that her daughter might not want to be found. And yet, deep down, beneath the layers of doubt and fear, there was something else. Something small but undeniable. Hope. She wasn't ready to let go of it just yet. Evelyn Monroe had never been one to wait. She was a woman of action, a force that dictated the pace of her world rather than being at the mercy of it. And yet, here she was, trapped in a suffocating stillness, waiting for a call that might never come. The note she had left on the check had been a risk, one she had taken knowing it could end in silence. But that did not make the silence any easier to bear. She sat in her penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath her like a vast, indifferent sea, her phone lying on the glass table before her. She had left it untouched for hours, refusing to give in to the childish impulse to check it every few minutes. If her daughter, Lily, or whatever name she had now, wanted to respond, she would. And if she didn't, Evelyn had no control over that. Control. It had been the foundation of her life, the one thing she had clung to when everything else had slipped away. But this was a situation she could not command, could not shape to her will, and it terrified her. The hours dragged on, stretching into a restless night, then into the next morning. Evelyn told herself she would not allow this to consume her. She had spent a lifetime learning how to endure, how to bury pain beneath layers of discipline and ambition. She had meetings to attend, business to oversee. The world did not pause for personal grief. But no matter how much she tried to focus, her mind betrayed her, returning again and again to the image of the young woman in the cafe. The way she had carried herself, the way her fingers had absently touched the pendant at her throat, the guarded look in her eyes when Evelyn had asked about it. She had seen it before, in her own reflection. It was past noon when her phone finally rang. The sound shattered the quiet like a hammer striking glass. Evelyn snatched it up without thinking, her heart a sudden violent drum in her chest. The number was unfamiliar. She pressed the answer button, forcing her voice into steadiness. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. A hesitation, a breath. Then, finally, a voice. "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't appreciate whatever game you're playing." The words were sharp, clipped with anger. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself against the tide of emotions that surged within her. She had prepared for this. She had known, from the moment she saw the pendant, that this would not be easy. "I assure you," she said, keeping her tone measured, "this is not a game." A bitter laugh. "Then what is it? Some kind of sick joke?" "No," Evelyn said softly. "It's not." Another silence, this one heavier, filled with something raw and uncertain. "Who are you?" the woman asked. Evelyn hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because the weight of the truth was so immense that she feared what it might do once spoken aloud. "My name is Evelyn Monroe," she said finally, "and I believe I'm your mother." The breath on the other end of the line hitched, then came a long pause. "No." The denial was immediate, forceful. "That's not possible." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I know this is a lot to process. I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I know that pendant. I know because I gave it to you." More silence. But this time Evelyn could hear the subtle shift beneath the anger, a crack in the certainty, a sliver of doubt. "That doesn't mean anything," the woman said, but her voice lacked the same fire. "I grew up in foster care. I don't know where this necklace came from. For all I know, it was just something the system gave me." Evelyn's chest tightened. Foster care. The words carried a weight she had never fully considered. She had always known that her daughter had been taken from her, placed somewhere out of reach. But she had clung to the hope that she had been adopted by a family, that she had been loved, protected, foster care. That was something else entirely. She swallowed against the rising tide of emotion. "I don't know what you were told," she said carefully, "but I swear to you, I never abandoned you. You were taken from me." A sharp inhale. "No, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to come here after all these years and pretend you cared." The pain in her voice was palpable, and Evelyn felt it like a knife to the ribs. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Evelyn said, "but please, meet with me. Let me explain." There was a long pause, then a sharp exhale. "I don't know," the woman said finally. "I don't know if I want to hear anything you have to say." Evelyn closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I understand? Do you?" The words were sharp. "Do you understand what it's like to grow up not knowing where you came from, to feel like you were thrown away?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "No," she admitted, "I don't. But I do know what it's like to lose the only thing that ever truly mattered." Another silence. This one stretched so long that Evelyn feared she had hung up. Then, finally, a sigh. "I'll think about it." The line went dead before Evelyn could respond. She lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as if willing it to ring again. She had found her daughter, but finding her was only the beginning. The real battle had just begun. Evelyn sat in the quiet solitude of her penthouse, staring out at the sprawling city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The twinkling lights of New York stretched out endlessly, a sea of movement and life that continued oblivious to the storm raging within her. The phone call still echoed in her ears, every word, every breath a mark seared into her memory. She had waited so long for this moment, for even the smallest chance to find her daughter, to look into her eyes and see something of herself reflected back. But the reality was harsher than she had let herself imagine. Her daughter, whoever she was now, was not the innocent child Evelyn had lost. She was a woman who had been forced to forge her own path, to grow up in a world without the security of family, without the knowledge of where she had come from. She was angry. She was hurt, and she had every right to be. Evelyn had told herself she was prepared for rejection, but the pain of hearing the bitterness in her voice had been sharper than she expected. She had made her first move. Now she had to wait. The waiting stretched into days. Evelyn went about her routine as though nothing had changed. Meetings, negotiations, the endless cycle of business that had once been her entire world. But now it felt hollow. Every hour that passed without a call, every night that ended with the phone sitting silent beside her bed, chipped away at the fragile hope she had dared to hold on to. But on the fourth day, it happened. The call came just after 8 in the evening. Evelyn had been reading through reports at her desk, though her focus had been elsewhere, drifting back to the young woman in the cafe, to the pendant, to the moment she had felt the ground shift beneath her. When the phone buzzed, she nearly knocked it over in her rush to grab it. She answered without hesitation. A pause, a breath. Then the voice she had been waiting to hear. "I don't know why I'm calling," her daughter said. "I told myself I wouldn't." Evelyn forced herself to stay steady. "But you did." Another pause. "Yeah." Evelyn let the silence linger, afraid that if she pushed too hard, she would break whatever fragile thread was holding this conversation together. "Where do you want to meet?" her daughter asked finally. It took a moment for the words to register. Evelyn exhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "Anywhere you feel comfortable." There was another long silence, then a decision. The same cafe, tomorrow morning, 9. And then, just like the first time, the line went dead before Evelyn could say anything more. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the cafe half an hour early. It was foolish, she knew, but she couldn't sit still in her penthouse, couldn't pretend as though this was just another meeting, another carefully orchestrated moment in her controlled life. She ordered a coffee but barely touched it, her fingers tapping restlessly against the ceramic cup. At precisely 9, the door opened, and she was there. Evelyn's breath caught at the sight of her. She was wearing a dark jacket, her curls pulled back into a loose bun, her expression guarded as she scanned the cafe. When she spotted Evelyn, there was a flicker of hesitation before she approached the table. Neither of them spoke at first. The weight of what they were about to discuss pressed down on them both. Finally, her daughter sat down, folding her arms across her chest. "So," she said, "talk." Evelyn had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt heavy in her throat. "I never wanted to give you up," she said finally. "They took you from me." A bitter scoff. "Who?" "My parents." The words tasted like old regret. "The Moncros. They were powerful, controlling, and they believed that my relationship with your father was a disgrace." The young woman stiffened at the mention of her father. "Who was he?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated. "His name was James Carter. He was a musician." The reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "What?" Evelyn pressed. The woman shook her head. "I don't know. That name? It sounds familiar." She rubbed her forehead as if trying to pull a memory from the depths of her mind. "But I don't remember anything about him. I don't remember anything from before foster care." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "They didn't tell you anything?" "No, I was passed around. No one cared enough to tell me where I came from." Her fingers brushed against the pendant absently. "All I had was this." Evelyn swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I gave that to you. It was your father's." For the first time, her daughter looked at her with something other than hostility, something closer to confusion. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you looking for me after all this time?" Evelyn exhaled slowly. "Because I never stopped." A bitter laugh. "That's hard to believe." "I don't expect you to believe me," Evelyn admitted, "but it's the truth. I looked for you for years, but there were no records, no way to find you. And now," she hesitated, "I'm old, and I couldn't bear the thought of dying without knowing if you were out there." Something flickered across her daughter's face, uncertainty. "This doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice was quieter now. "I know." A long silence stretched between them. The weight of 50 years sat between them, impossible to erase. Finally, the young woman stood. "I need time," she said. Evelyn nodded. "Take all the time you need." Her daughter hesitated. "My name is Leah." It took Evelyn a moment to understand what had just happened. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in 50 years, she felt something close to hope. Evelyn had learned patience over the years, but waiting for Leah to decide what she wanted to do next was unlike any kind of patience she had ever practiced. It was a delicate, uncertain kind of waiting, filled with moments where she found herself reaching for her phone only to force her hand away. The last thing she wanted to do was scare her daughter away. Leah needed time, and Evelyn had to respect that. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Evelyn filled the hours with work, meetings, charity events, anything to keep her mind occupied, but nothing could fully drown out the thoughts that lingered in the background. She thought of their last conversation, of the way Leah had hesitated before leaving, the way she had finally given Evelyn her name. That alone had felt like a lifeline, fragile but real. It meant something. She just had to hope it would lead to something more. When Leah finally called, it was on a quiet Sunday evening. Evelyn had been sitting in her library, a book open in front of her that she hadn't really been reading. The moment her phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, her heart skipped. She picked up on the second ring, forcing her voice to stay steady. "It's me," Leah said without preamble. Evelyn didn't dare exhale too loudly. "I'm glad you called." Another pause. "I don't know what I want from this," Leah admitted. I have questions." Evelyn nodded, even though Leah couldn't see her. "I'll answer anything you want to know." There was another pause, filled with the sound of distant city noise in the background. "Can we meet again?" Relief and anxiety surged in equal measure. "Of course. Whenever you're ready." Leah hesitated before saying, "Tomorrow, same place." Evelyn clutched the phone tighter. "I'll be there." The next morning, she arrived before Leah, as she had the first time. She sat at the same table, sipping a coffee that she barely tasted, waiting. When Leah finally walked in, Evelyn saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she scanned the cafe as if preparing herself for something difficult. But she had come. That was what mattered. Leah sat down across from her and took a deep breath. "I want to hear everything," she said. "Not just the good parts, the real story. What happened?" Evelyn had spent decades keeping the past locked away in a part of her mind she rarely allowed herself to visit. Now, she unlatched the door and let the memories spill forward. She told Leah about her parents, about their power, their control, the way they had shaped every aspect of her life. She told her about James, how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had tried to fight for what they had. She described the way her parents had found out, the cold fury in her father's eyes, the suffocating weight of her mother's disappointment. She told Leah how they had locked her away, how they had taken every choice from her, how they had stolen her child and erased every trace of her existence from Evelyn's life. She didn't try to soften the story, didn't try to paint herself as the perfect victim. She admitted her own weaknesses, her failures, the ways in which she had been too young, too afraid, too powerless to stop what had happened. And she told her the hardest truth of all, that by the time she had gathered the strength to fight back, it had been too late. Leah listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. Only when Evelyn finished did she finally speak. "So they just took me?" Evelyn's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Yes." Leah exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "And you didn't try to find me?" "I did," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "For years. I hired detectives, searched records, followed every lead I could find, but they covered their tracks too well. The orphanage you were sent to, it was shut down, the files destroyed. I kept searching, but there was nothing." Leah was silent for a long moment. "I used to think about her," she said finally. "My mother. I didn't know anything about her, but I used to wonder if she had just thrown me away." Evelyn's chest ached. "I never wanted to give you up." Leah looked down at the table, her fingers brushing against the pendant around her neck. "I don't know what to do with this." Evelyn didn't push. She had learned, in just the short time she had known Leah, that she needed space to process things in her own way. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Evelyn said. "I don't expect you to forgive me, or to let me into your life just because of what I told you. I just wanted you to know the truth." Leah looked up at her then, and there was something in her expression, uncertainty, pain, but also something softer, something that hadn't been there before. "I need time," Leah said. Evelyn nodded. "Take all the time you need." Leah stood, hesitating for just a second before saying, "I'll call you." And then she was gone, leaving Evelyn alone with the weight of everything she had just shared. But this time, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. It wasn't a rejection. It was something else. It was a beginning. Evelyn had learned to live with uncertainty, but this was different. For the first time in 50 years, there was a door that was not closed but only slightly ajar. Leah had not rejected her outright. She had listened. She had asked questions. She had given Evelyn her name. And now she had walked away with the promise, no, the possibility of returning. Possibility was a fragile thing, but Evelyn clung to it like a lifeline. She didn't expect Leah to call right away. She understood that this wasn't just about the past. It was about undoing years of pain, of unanswered questions, of wounds that had never been given the chance to heal. And yet, the waiting was unbearable. Evelyn forced herself to stay busy, filling her days with meetings, business affairs, and philanthropy work. But everything felt secondary now, as though the foundation of her life had shifted beneath her feet. The call came almost 2 weeks later. It was late in the evening, the city glowing through her windows, when the phone vibrated on the marble countertop of her kitchen. Evelyn recognized the number immediately, her breath catching as she reached for it. "I don't know why I'm calling," Leah said as soon as Evelyn answered. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. "But you are." There was a pause, the sound of city traffic in the background. "I've been thinking," Leah said finally, "about what you told me." Evelyn stayed silent, giving her the space to speak. "I don't know what I expected when I met you. Maybe I thought you'd try to make excuses, try to say it wasn't your fault. But you didn't." A breath. "And I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything right now," Evelyn said. "There's no timeline for this." Leah exhaled. "I guess I just keep coming back to the same question. What now?" It was a fair question. It was the only question that mattered. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "That's up to you." Another pause. "I don't want to pretend like we're something we're not," Leah said. "I don't know you, and you don't know me." "That's true. But I guess—" There was uncertainty in her voice, something raw and hesitant. "I guess I want to." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, the words settling deep into her chest. "Then let's start there." They began slowly, cautiously. Leah wasn't ready for anything dramatic, and Evelyn understood that. So they met in small ways, a lunch here, a coffee there. Evelyn let Leah set the pace, never pressing too hard, never asking for more than what was offered. She learned about the life her daughter had built on her own, the struggles she had faced, the resilience that had carried her through. She listened more than she spoke, because she knew she had missed a lifetime, and she wanted to hear every piece of it. Leah, in turn, started to ask questions, not just about the past, but about Evelyn's life now, about her work, her home, the world she had built for herself. There were still walls between them, still an unspoken distance, but it was no longer impassable. It was something they were slowly learning to cross. One evening, they met in Central Park. It was chilly, the kind of autumn air that hinted at the winter to come. They walked along the winding paths, the golden leaves crunching beneath their feet, speaking in quiet tones about nothing in particular. "I never expected any of this," Leah admitted after a while. Evelyn glanced at her. Neither did I. Leah let out a small, dry laugh. You know, when I was younger, I used to dream that my mother would come find me. That one day she'd show up and take me away from everything. She shook her head. But then I got older and I stopped believing in things like that. Evelyn's throat tightened. I wish I had found you sooner. Leah looked at her, something unreadable in her gaze. Me too. It wasn't an acceptance, not entirely, but it was something. The weeks passed and the walls continued to lower inch by inch. Evelyn invited Leah to her home one evening, hesitant but hopeful. She had expected hesitation, maybe even a rejection, but Leah surprised her. She said yes. When she arrived, Evelyn felt a strange nervousness settle over her, an emotion she wasn't accustomed to. She had hosted presidents, royalty, the most powerful figures in the world, but this was different. This was her daughter stepping into a space that had never belonged to her before. Leah took in the grand penthouse with wary eyes, her fingers trailing lightly along the marble countertop in the kitchen. This is a lot, she said finally. Evelyn let out a small chuckle. I suppose it is. Leah turned to her. Did you ever think about what it would have been like if I had grown up here? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. Every day. Leah was silent for a long moment. Then she exhaled and moved to sit on one of the stools by the kitchen island. Tell me more about him, she said. Evelyn didn't need to ask who she meant. She told Leah about James. Not just the facts, but the little things. The way he played the piano late into the night, the way he used to hum when he was thinking, the way his laughter had filled whatever space he was in. She told her about their dreams, the plans they had made, the life they had imagined before it had all been taken from them. Leah listened, her expression unreadable. When Evelyn finished, she reached up and touched the pendant around her neck, as if grounding herself in the connection that had survived all these years. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to call you Mom, Leah said quietly. Evelyn felt a sharp sting of pain, but she didn't let it show. That's okay. Leah met her gaze. But I want to keep getting to know you. Evelyn swallowed past the lump in her throat. That's all I could ask for. As they sat there, the city stretched out beyond them, the skyline painted in soft golds and deep blues. There was still so much between them, so many things that couldn't be fixed, so many years that couldn't be reclaimed, but they had something now. And sometimes something was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful and emotional stories. And if this one moved you, share it with others. You never know who might need to hear it.